everybody. My name is Carol Adams and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Sustainability here at Latrobe University. I'm responsible for embedding sustainability in the university's operations, in our curriculum and in our research activities. My background and my research is in accounting, where it takes all sorts to fix the world's problems, sustainability reporting and sustainability management. I want to congratulate you all on being here today and attending this conference. You are the future leaders and you can create a better future. We know from market research that we've conducted that employers think that sustainability has become a mainstream concern, that it goes beyond public relations and communication and impacts on core business issues. They expect line managers and organisational leaders to understand the core issues rather than leave it just to sustainability specialists. And they want managers and staff who understand sustainability and who can apply sustainability thinking to business and policy issues. We know that students think that climate change and sustainability is one of the top 3 issues facing us today, that around half feel that career opportunities in renewable energy, environmental management and sustainability are growing, and the majority feel that having sustainability skills would be an advantage in their chosen career. Now, we've partnered with OurSay to stimulate a discussion on these issues that you feel are important, to find out what they are and have a discussion. We believe it's our role as a university not only to provide leadership and knowledge of these issues, but also to step back and provide a place where discussion on these issues can take place. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. You can find us on Latrobe Generations to keep up with both what we're doing and what we're seeing as being key issues out there around sustainability. The OurSay platform provides a way of getting views of a wide section of society, finding out what you think is important, and we're here today to discuss the top 3 questions that were put on the website. But through the questions that were asked, they together, collectively, highlighted your concerns about increasing renewable energy use, the overpopulation of our planet and the effect of that on the planet's resources, the use of Australia's large fossil fuel reserves, and the importance of political process and the power of democracy in driving change. To answer your questions, I have with me, first of all on my left, Andrew Hewitt, who is the Executive Director of Oxfam Australia. Andrew joined Oxfam in 1991, initiating Oxfam's advocacy programs and coordinating Oxfam's international response to the Timor-Leste crisis between 1999 and 2001. He became Executive Director of Oxfam Australia in 2001 and increased Oxfam's focus on lobbying government and providing public education on issues of social justice and development. He's a renowned voice on climate change, global poverty and humanitarian issues, and a contributor to the ABC's The Drum and The Punch. He's a committee member for the Australian Council of International Development and co-chair of the Make Poverty History campaign. Next to him is Professor Dennis Altman, who is Director of the Institute of Human Security at Latrobe University. He first came to notice with the publication of his book, Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, in 1972. Dennis is a renowned gay rights activist and has made a significant intellectual contribution to the ideas that shape the gay liberation movements in the English-speaking world. He was appointed the Visiting Chair of Australian Studies at Harvard University in 2005 and is author of 11 books, including the hugely cited Global Sex and AIDS in the Mind of America. Next to Dennis, we have Kate. Professor Kate Orty is the Victorian Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability. She established the first Victorian Curie Court and was the inaugural Curie Court magistrate. Kate served as chairperson of the Victorian Ministerial Reference Council for Climate Change Adaptation and as a member of the Premier's Reference Group on Climate Change. She is a member of both the Latrobe University External Sustainability Advisory Board and the Latrobe Institute of Social and Environmental Sustainability Advisory Board. She has undertaken a number of consultancies, including a project on local government and climate change for the National Environmental Law Association. Now to your questions. The question with the most votes was posed by Wahid Hussain. Is Wahid here today? Hello. Congratulations, Wahid. Wahid said, "We are spending millions of dollars to find water in Mars and Uranus. We are spending billions of dollars to create cities in the desert and sea. But whenever we ask to protect Somali from drought, we have nothing. Whenever we ask to protect the beautiful Maldives or Bangladesh from the sea, no nation wants to spend a single penny." Wahid and the hundreds who voted for this question are concerned that the spend on aid relative to space operations. But Wahid also raises the question as to where aid is most needed. Now I have a few figures for you. NASA's space operations budget for 2012 is $4.29 billion US dollars. There are at least 13 organisations working against hunger, poverty, sanitation and water shortages in Africa with a spend in excess of US $1.5 billion. The spend on relief by the UNHCR and partners on Somali was $1 billion US dollars in 2011. The multilateral development banks are funding only $110 million for climate resilience infrastructure programs in Bangladesh. And the United Nations Development Group have allocated about $10 million to spend in the Maldives. With a 1 metre sea level rise, about 0.3% or 194,000 square kilometres and 56 million people in 84 developing countries will be impacted. An estimated 1.3% of gross domestic product will be lost for those countries. In terms of population impacted, the top countries impacted are in fact Vietnam and Egypt. In terms of natural disasters in 2011, China had more victims from natural disasters with 159.3 million people affected by flood, drought and storm. So those are a few facts, and I want now first of all to turn to Kate to ask, Kate, is the distribution of funds here a problem?
I think that this is on, and the answer to the question clearly, having those figures and knowing about what's happening to people who are exposed to the way those figures operate in the distribution is clearly yes. So clearly yes. The issue for us, of course, in my office as the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability here in Victoria is how we are confronting the issue of climate change. And I just want to put on notice that some of the issues about this region, and some of you will have been spending a bit of time thinking about this, because while it also speaks about the Maldives and Bangladesh, we have people, of course, here in this region who are struggling with these issues as well in the Torres Strait, and I've spent time recently talking to Torres Strait Islander people about just exactly that issue of climate change and sea level rise, and they ask the same question. It's a question that needs to be answered. We also have people who are going to be confronting what we will see as the increasing heat in Australia. And we know that Indigenous people, in particular in the desert regions, and people west and north of here are going to be impacted by that. So we also know that that's going to be an issue for us. My point is, it's an issue for all of us. It's an issue that's global. It's an issue that we all need to think about. And I agree with you absolutely that it's something where we need to reconsider the distribution and redistribute these sorts of amounts of money. But I also want to say from the work my office does that this is not a time for hopelessness or for thinking that there's nothing you can do and that's why you're all here. My office has recently spent time all over Victoria, and we've spent time talking to young people and older people, farmers and shopkeepers, school teachers and school students, school parents and people who run local government. And it seems to me that everybody's asking that question, what can I do about it? What we're finding is when people have the resourcefulness to get together, to participate and to assure each other of their needs being the same as other people's needs, that we will be able to generate some form of change. So my message is, yes, we are wasteful. We need to stop being wasteful. We need to redistribute what we do currently spend on these sorts of projects that are clearly wasteful, and we need to know that we can do something about it, and certainly we can. Participation is the thing that makes us resourceful. In making us resourceful, it makes us inventive. In doing both of those things, it guides change.
Look, I think it's a very timely question, a very pertinent question, because it goes to the heart of a whole range of things. It's the question of resources and where resources are deployed and what priority is given to creating a more just and a fairer world is a very strong one. This year, for instance, overseas aid levels declined for the first time in a decade. Developed countries, rich countries around the globe have by and large been tightening their belts and have cut overseas aid. It's not been a universal picture. Australia's actually increased the overseas aid budget. Britain, despite the fact it's in the depths of a recession, has legislated to continue to increase their aid budgets. But countries like Spain or Netherlands or Italy have all cut their spending. There's also, it's not, resources are part of the question. It's also about policies which are being put in place. The fact that I believe international trade can be a force for poverty eradication. We currently have the Doha round of World Trade Organisation negotiations which have been going for well over a decade, with little prospect that they're going to be finalised any time in the near future. And that round is supposed to be a development round. It's supposed to be realising the developmental benefits of international trade. So what we've got here is fewer resources being allocated to trying to create a fairer world, fewer policy decisions which are benefiting that objective. And meantime, we're spending resources in other ways, in some of the ways that you suggest through the question. I think another example is around climate change, where even funding for climate change adaptation in developing countries, for countries to cope with the consequences of climate change here and now, consequences being in terms of susceptibility to humanitarian disasters or to the impacts of the livelihoods or changes to disease patterns and the like. Those resources are not easy to find. One of the other issues that's picked up there is also around prevention. OurSay's done studies that show that if you move an humanitarian disaster early, you spend $1 then at an early stage of a disaster, you save spending $7 down the track trying to keep people alive later on. I think there's a real issue for me is both highlighting those issues about resource distribution, but importantly what we've got to try to do is develop connections between people in countries like Australia and in countries like some of the ones that you mentioned in your question, Bangladesh, Maldives, Somalia, developing a greater sense of empathy, a greater sense of understanding those linkages. And that's one of the ways in which we can help turn the tide, so to speak, and develop a more just distribution of resources, a more conscious and better set of policies.
Dennis, climate change issues and human security issues are very closely linked. Is the cut in aid funding a real problem, or are there other things that need to be done to fix some of these problems?
Unfortunately, we couldn't afford to have Tony Abbott on the platform, but I think somebody needs to play the devil's advocate, and those of you who know me will realise that I will relish doing that. So I actually want to pick up a couple of things and say that firstly I think the question makes a whole set of assumptions that are just not true. It is really not true that no money is spent in helping people who are in desperate situations. And I'm not only thinking of government money, I'm thinking of the fact that in Australia and many other rich countries, there is a constant flow of private support. And Andrew will remember the extraordinary response in this country to the tsunami. So let's not get into what is too easy, a guilt-tripping of the rich. I'm perfectly happy to guilt-trip the rich when they are Gina Reinhardt or Clive Palmer, or indeed people who drive unnecessary four-wheel drives in the inner city, which I would happily ban, in fact go around wishing I could shoot their tyres and cause massive inconvenience to them. But there are, I think, nuances. The real point I want to make, and I think will flow through to all of the questions, human beings will act out of a mix of self-interest and altruism. We cannot only appeal to altruism. I agree entirely, of course, with Andrew. I would love to see a world in which people felt a sense of global citizenship. But I think we have to understand that we all are motivated by a whole set of different factors. And the trick is to show people that their self-interest demands a world in which there is much less inequality, that their self-interest demands that there are not millions of people facing starvation. Their self-interest demands that the rising sea levels, which threaten the existence of whole nation states, is a really serious and important question. And so I guess what I was struck with, and I'll make this as a comment, Carol, about all the questions today, there's a lot of indignation coming through, and indignation is great. We need to feel indignation. There are many things we should be indignant about, and there are many things we should be angry about. But we have to then move on from that and think strategically. And we have to think what arguments will persuade people who don't feel that indignation, who have a different moral view of the world, and how do we bring them along with us? Because I would say in the present political climate in this country or in the United States, which, while one of the meanest countries per head in giving aid, is also a hugely important country because of its sheer size, the dominant political mood is one in which self-interest is overriding altruism. And that, for me, is the huge political question that I think we all need to try and work through.
Can I comment? Yeah, I'd like to add my voice to those observations, both observations actually, but speak about the environmental movement. It's very clear that there can be a lot of tub-thumping about the environment, and there needs to be. But we've recognised that there are ways in which you can in fact bring people along with you when they might not have the same agenda, they might not think strategically about the issue in the same way, they might not even admire your tactics. But the reality is that if you can encourage people to think there will be co-benefits, you can get people to come on board. And I think that's one of the things that's driving lots of change in business, and Carol and others on the table might want to comment about that. We see it all the time, and while I'm not a great adherent of private enterprise having to fund the sorts of aid that we need to see, we do know that private enterprise will be part of the equation, and they do see co-benefits, reputational and otherwise. So don't put aside even something as seemingly simple as a reputational issue. It's all important, and it's all grist to the mill, and it's all potentially something that you can use to advance things that you think are important.
I absolutely agree, Kate. Private enterprise has a very key role, and many companies today are taking on board the concerns of their staff about some of these issues, and they're doing it for a number of reasons, but one of them is to attract the best graduates. So ask about, you can make a difference by asking about their corporate social responsibility practices if you're going to work in business, and putting pressure on them and encouraging them to do more. But I'd like now to turn to our second question, which was asked by Wendy Octalis. Is Wendy here? Okay. And there are some similarities here with the first question. Wendy has asked, since 1952, 1.7 trillion has been given to Israel by the US, most of it going towards the brutalization of Palestinians and their land. The richest 2% of the world's population spend more on organic food than 74% of humanity spend on basic life-sustaining food. The richest 300 people in Europe and North America have the same income as 4.7 billion poor people. How can we tackle climate change, global poverty, human rights abuses right now? That's what Wenny wants to know. Now, we've had a bit of trouble corroborating some of those figures, but there are significant disparities in the distribution of wealth around our planet. For example, we do know that 2% of adults in the world own more than half of the global household wealth, and that the richest 50 million people in Europe and North America have the same income as 2.7 billion poor people. Now, political systems are engaged in causes that are tying up capital, other resources, and they're diverting attention from sustainability issues which do need to be tackled. So I want to ask the panel now, how can we work together, given this uneven distribution of wealth, given the different political ideologies around the world, which to address climate change, which is something which is going to impact on all of us? How can we work together to address it? And how can this generation, your generation, this generation of future leaders really make a difference in the world? Who would like to start with that one?
Yes. Well, I volunteered because I wanted to, remembering I'm channeling Tony Abbott and the rest of them. There is actually, I think, a quite serious point I wanted to make. When I read this question, I was struck by how I think unhelpful it is to lump together a whole set of quite different issues. I am not going to defend the United States' support of Israel, and I'm not going to defend Israel's occupation of the West Bank. But let us think for a moment in terms of this question, the previous question about China. China is currently embarking on a very ambitious space program. So if we're going to start worrying about spending lots of money on space exploration, it isn't only the nasty Americans. The Chinese are competing to waste just as much money for exactly the same macho reasons that they want to have things revolving around the world to show us that they're dominant, okay? Secondly, if we're going to talk about current human rights abuses, we have to think about the role of China, and indeed the role of Russia, in supporting the current regime in Syria. So can we please get out of this simple-minded picture that came through, I'm afraid, in a lot of what I read on the web, that somehow we in the, quote, West, which is not a term I like, but we in the countries associated with the United States and its allies are always to blame, and that the rest of the world is somehow virtuous. This is not helpful. It's not helpful because it's not accurate, and it therefore stops us asking the real question, which is the one Carol's trying to address. We have some huge issues about what is happening to human beings, either individually, and most of us have seen those horrendous images of the woman who was shot in Afghanistan for alleged adultery, or what's happening collectively as a consequence of the sorts of major shifts going on as structural inequality expands and as the gap between the rich and the poor increases. And I think that the real role of people like us, and by us I'm transcending generations, Carol, because, I don't want to be made to feel grandpa up here. We have, I think, a common interest in finding ways of raising these issues in ways that will engage people and make them concrete. And I think that Kate already pointed out that if you go around and talk to people and relate what's happening in their lives to what's happening in a bigger world, you can often get somewhere. And again, to go back to the comment I made earlier, and I'd be interested to hear Andrew's comment on that, my sense is there was a huge outpouring in Australia of support for people who were affected by the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, because there was an immediate sense in which people could empathise with human loss. And I would go back to what I said at the beginning. Human beings are complex. We are motivated by self-interest. We can also be motivated by altruism. And so our role is to find smarter ways of encouraging people to bring those two together. But I don't think, and this really takes me to where I began, I really do not think seriously that guilt-tripping and constantly pointing the finger and constantly blaming a few countries as if they had a monopoly on evil is helpful, nor is it accurate.
Thank you very much for that, Dennis. Andrew?
I interpreted the question slightly differently. And what I was reading into the question was a concern for equity or a concern for equality. And I think this maybe speaks to one of the points that Dennis has made about the need to appeal to both to altruism but also self-interest. There's a study which, for me, a book which I read relatively recently, which I think has been highly influential in quite a bit of my thinking, is called The Spirit Level. And it looked across about 25 different measures of well-being in about 20 different developed countries. And they did the same study across all 50 states of the United States. And it looked at issues like life expectancy, infant mortality, looked at issues like teenage pregnancies, numbers of deaths from firearms, all a range of well-being indicators. And essentially, those countries which were more equitable tended to figure more strongly on the well-being indicators. They had a better record there. Even for the richer members of those societies, they had performed better, had greater life expectancy, they had a greater quality of life in the more equitable societies than those societies where there was gross inequality. And I think, given one of the real trends which I think we are seeing across the globe is towards a greater inequality both within countries and between countries, that's a remarkably important study. And I think it provides the potential to appeal both to altruism and to self-interest, in the sense that people can be, even if you're going to be in the, to use the Occupy jargon, in the 1%, you will have a better life if you live in a more equitable society. And that's quite powerful, because I think the inequality is not just between countries, it is within countries. We've seen that in Australia, we've seen it in the United States, but we also see reality now that for Oxfam, we look at where the world's poor now live. Where are people living in absolute poverty? They are no longer, in the main, living in least developed countries. The majority, something like 2/3 of the world's poor, live in middle-income countries. Middle-income countries are countries with a per capita income of between $1,000 and $10,000 US. And so India has about 450 million people living in absolute poverty. Indonesia has about 60 million people living in poverty, but they're middle-income countries. And that, again, it will be a considerable drag on their development of the whole of the nation, the longer they persist with those degrees of inequality. So again, it's appealing both to altruism, but it's also appealing to self-interest. So I think we need to have a greater understanding of the impacts of gross levels of inequality, of the poor living cheek by jowl with the rich, and what the consequences are for well-being, as a way of appealing to people's altruism, but more to the point, as a way of appealing to their self-interest.
Thank you, Andrew. And of course, a great concern is that climate change issues and the consequences of climate change will increase inequalities between countries and between people. Our third question comes from Kerry Hillier Adams, and her question is, while 1 in 7 people around the world go hungry, both developing and developed countries waste around 33% of their food. On the one hand, in countries like Australia, consumers and retailers throw away perfectly good food, and on the other, developing countries lack the infrastructure to maximise the potential of harvests. How can we change the way we think about food to make the distribution systems more fair, and what can we do to ensure that we will appreciate the abundance of food we have in Australia and reduce our food wastage? How does this relate to Australia's own food security? Now this is a big issue, particularly given that there are so many people in the world who don't have enough food. Who's going to address that first? What can we do about this? Andrew?
A big question. As the question indicates, something like 14% of the world's population go hungry every day. Most of those people who are going hungry are food producers themselves, and a very high proportion of them are women. Women, small-scale farmers, comprise the majority of the world's hungry. In Australia, this question indicates we waste a lot of food. I think the figure that I've heard is something like $5 billion worth of food that's wasted every year. In developing countries, it's about 40% of food waste occurs post-harvest and processing. And that's because of lack of storage, lack of effective transportation, lack of refrigeration. It's because of that lack of investment in agricultural development. How do we get a better sense of food? Well, I'm really trying to avoid the call that I think many of us got when we were children and were reluctant to finish everything on our plate. Think about the starving children in India, which used to be the line, or the starving children in Ethiopia. I'm not, to pick up one of Dennis's lines, I think that sort of guilt tripping only builds up resistance amongst children, and I think probably that resistance trend continues into adulthood. I think we need to develop that sense of connection again, that sense of empathy, but also to develop that sense of enlightened self-interest, to use the term. Understanding that the food system, we've got a broken food system at the moment when we produce enough food for everyone on the planet to prosper, but it's not distributed effectively, we're not investing in the right sorts of measures. And investing in women small-scale farmers, for me, is the key to really trying to tackle this issue. And that requires changes in policies, it requires changes in aid policies, changes in government policies in many of those middle-income countries. And that's the way we're most likely to be able to achieve a world where hunger is really a thing of the past.
Can I just say something on that, Lou? I picked up on this question. We've all interpreted questions a little differently on the panel, and that's to be expected. But I picked up on the part of this question that talks about how can we change the way we think. And I didn't go on to observe it about food, just how can we change the way we think. My office writes reports. We write reports that get read or don't get read. They change policy or they don't change policy. The recommendations do or don't get picked up. They are or are not interesting. They are or are not inviting. They do or do not talk about things that people care about. They either do or don't understand the importance of the local, of the gendered, of the issues that people confront in their daily lives, and the importance of having those discussed in a meaningful, purposeful, ethical, thoughtful way. So we can write reports about this all the time and change the way nobody thinks. You're all stepping into careers from where you go from here, no doubt, to think about the way you think and the way the people that you work with think and the way the policies impact on governments think. There's going to be a massive role here for all of you to think about communicating messages. If I think about how we fail to communicate climate change science in this country, I'm constantly asked by scientists, how can we communicate science better? As a lawyer, I know that we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can communicate law better, how we can be better lawyers, how we can involve people in questions of justice with greater efficacy. We need to think about how we communicate, and that's a role for every single one of you and every one of us. And in doing that, we need to think about what we do by way of reporting. And we have to think about how we're going to instill messages in people by reframing the questions, taking carriage of the questions, and communicating and participating with each other and across sectors, across scale, across time, and across cultures. I know this stuff can be done, and we've done it in circumstances where I've worked in Aboriginal sentencing courts, where you change the way a court staff understand their involvement with an Indigenous community. And you watch it happen in local areas, in intensely political and local places, and you watch people change. It is about how we communicate, it is a challenge, but it's the sort of thing that you're all going to be infinitely more able to do probably than my generation was, for one reason alone, and that's because you're going to be capturing, taking charge of, taking over social media. Go for it.
Can I make two quick comments? First really is about food, which is just to remind us that often we talk about in rich countries obesity as a huge, big health issue, and we forget it is actually also a big, huge health issue in many poor countries as a result of inadequate access to food. And I'm actually going to put in a plug because my sister works for Foreign Correspondent, and Foreign Correspondent are doing a very big program on this in a couple of weeks where they're looking at obesity in countries like Mexico and India. But the second point I wanted to pick up on Andrew's stress on gender. If there were one single thing that we could do to change global inequity and global injustice, it would be to greatly empower women across the world in all areas of life, ranging from business and politics through to sexuality and relations in the home. And that again is, I think, a huge challenge. And if I'm going to be very careful about this, but my sense is that in the course of this week, from what I've seen of the program, that has not been addressed to nearly the extent or seriousness as it should have been.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I will take some questions in a moment, but before I do that, and I'll just give them some warning, I'm going to ask each panel member if they can leave you with one thought of something that can be done to address some of the problems that we face. Now, Kate has talked about the need to think about home, wherever that might be for each of us, that these problems are local as well as global. Dennis has implored us to stop pointing the finger at other parts of the world, at other countries, and think about what we can do ourselves. He's also pointed to the fact that climate change issues are perhaps actually making the difference between genders bigger, and what we need, as Dennis points out, is for them to get smaller. Andrew has talked about inequities and how they impact on the quality of life of all of us. Sustainability issues really do require us all to work together. They require people to work together from different functions within an organisation, from different disciplines, different academic backgrounds, and they require countries working together to solve them too. I'm going to ask each of our panel members, each of whom do come from very different backgrounds, but have got involved in these issues from those different background and perspectives, what they see as being a key thing that you can take away and think about to help create a better world, which was the question that we were addressing. Andrew.
I think we've got to do some thinking about how you achieve change. Because underpinning, I think, all three questions, and I suspect quite a bit of the discussions this week is about trying to change things, whatever those things may be. I think for many of us, the initial impetus to get involved in activity, to try to change things, is anger, it's a concern, be it at the moment about inequities, about climate change, about famine in East Africa or whatever, whatever motivates it's anger, it's concern. But anger and concern can only take you so far. There's got to be a belief that there is a possibility of achieving change. So inherently there's got to be some degree of optimism. It can't just be a negativity. I live by an adage which an Italian activist and theoretician Gramsci once used, which was a phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And for me, it's really saying that you've got to take a very rigorous understanding, have a very rigorous understanding about what you're up against, what the forces you're trying to change, what their strengths, what their arguments are, what their capabilities are, but also have that confidence that you can achieve change. It's important you don't delude yourself about the strength of the arguments, the strength of the resources you may be up against as you're trying to achieve change, but also have that optimism that you can build linkages, you can build coalitions, you can do things with others and with surprising allies to achieve change. Kate, I think, talked a bit about the private sector. For OurSay, we are finding more and more ways to collaborate with the private sector in quite unusual ways. I don't think we ask them to necessarily buy everything that we're on about, but we can find the areas of agreement to try to achieve change. So as I say, don't delude yourself in terms of what you're up against. Have that rigour, but have also matched that with the confidence, with the optimism that you can achieve change. And that's not a bad way to go about things.
I'm almost going to repeat what you say, but in a different way. And I've been really taken by Dennis's comment about women's issues, and probably they're not being picked up as they might have been in the week that you've just all had. One of the great lessons I've had from Indigenous women across Australia is this: that the question of indigeneity and gender is pivotal to almost everything that does impact on Aboriginal people and their families, and I'd be confident it's true across other cultures. What that's taught me, and there are two intensely practical things I want to say about where you go from here or what's useful to you. What that's taught me is this: play to your strengths. And it comes down to your point, I think, about making certain assumptions about what you're up against, but play to your strengths. Know what your strengths are. As a woman, know that your strength is going to be collaborating with other women and thinking about the issues of importance to other women. Not to the exclusion of other things, but play to your strengths. The second thing that I've learned, intensely practically, is this: make no assumptions. I can't tell you how many rooms I've walked into as the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability here in Victoria and thought that everybody in the room knew everybody else and was intensely networked to everybody else, to find that I was wrong. Make no assumptions about the strength or power of the people with whom you're engaging, because often you'll find that that assumption just is based on nothing but probably your own lack of confidence. Thirdly, just this: if you're thoughtful and you're purposeful and you know where you want to go, you will carry arguments, and you'll do it simply because of your capacity to persuade people of the equitable issues that underpin them.
I said at the beginning that I felt some sort of obligation to channel the views of people like Tony Abbott, and at the end I now want to take on my alter ego. If Tony Abbott were here, I have no doubt at some point he would have been able to refer to a great big new tax, even if he'd had to invent one for the purpose of this panel. I think that seriously, one of the most important things we need to do collectively is remind people that taxation is not about taking away something from an individual so that nasty governments have it. Taxation is how we pay for things that we all benefit from collectively. And this goes right to the heart of Andrew's point, that we all benefit from a more egalitarian society. A classic example is the craziness of the lack of universal health care in the United States, which means that everybody ends up, oddly enough, paying more for health care, even though large numbers of people don't have access to any of it. And what we really need to do, and what is, I think, the real challenge for those of you at this conference, is how do we take that argument to a global level and make a convincing argument that even those of us living well off in rich countries will be better off in a more equitable world. That in a world in which there are 400 million people hungry in India and 60 million people hungry in Indonesia, we suffer. And that is how I think we have to find new arguments that do, as I said at the beginning, bring together altruism and self-interest. None of us are going to do things entirely and solely for others, but at the same time, very few people, there are exceptions and they often own mines and want to own newspapers, very few of us are entirely motivated by greed. And I think changing that balance is the most important challenge for us, and in serious terms, the most important challenge if we literally want the planet to survive.